You know what you call this stuff. Well, anyway, we are we've used regenerative farm practices from the beginning. All our grain comes from specified farmers, and we had them build separate silos and separate grain trucks. As the business has grown from one truck, we now have.
You're fine. It's not.
No, it is.
Yeah.
We now have 25 farmers that control 55,000 acres, and it's all regenerative farming practices. And we only use about 9,000 of those acres, but it's a spreading trend. And I think our farmers in Kentucky finally realized we've got about 50 more harvests left, and we're out of topsoil if we don't do it. And like we haven't had a rain since the storm, the big storm, and we got to keep water in the soil. And this practice absolutely helps do that. So my son, I'm not sure he makes whiskey any better than I did, but he's a lot more friendly to the dirt. Yeah, I thought we were in the whiskey business back in the old days, but now we do everything else. But anyway, let me tell you just a little bit about my parents, because we do come from a whiskey family, but it's an odd family in that I guess we're the longest whiskey making family in the country as far as continuous. That's the good news. The bad news is most of it wasn't worth a damn. And that's what led to Maker's Mark. We're Scottish, and it came through Pennsylvania. The four great-grandfathers served with George Washington as a junior officer. He was a captain, and after the war, he went home, picked up the family still, his wife and her family, and came to Kentucky, and we continued the farming, distilling operation ever since. And when we had the war, the Second World War, the family company was sold. That was going to be the end of our distilling operations. My father served in the Navy. This, by the way, is a wonderful horse farm, Calumet. It's had some of the most famous horses that we've ever had in Kentucky, most of them back in the 40s and 50s. I think they have 6 Derby winners. Yes, the fence is bad. The fence is much worse where we're going, because you can't have white fences where you've got distilleries, because black mold. So remember that. If you ever want to have a little cottage in Kentucky, you have to be in this area where there's no distilleries, or up in the mountains of Kentucky. But around Bardstown, no such thing as a white fence. Anyway, God, Dad served in the Navy, was going to come home and be a gentleman farmer. We had a small farm in Bardstown. And he gets home and he finds out that Mom had run the farm during the war, and she didn't need his help, so it was obvious that very quickly that he was underfoot. And she put up with that for about 4 years and decided he needed to get a job. And he didn't want a job. So she advised him that she didn't care if he got a job or not, but he needed to get out of the house. So he came up with this idea. This was a terrible time for bourbon. Bourbon was really finished. And so distilleries were going on the market about one a week. And he got the idea that he could buy one of these little places cheap, and then it could become his retirement hobby. And the purpose of the retirement hobby was not to build a business, but to make a whiskey that was drinkable for a change. After 160 years of making crap, he was going to fix the family whiskey tradition before he went up to that great distillery in the sky. And off he went. And Mom quickly figured out that he was good at a couple of things and bad at a lot of things. And she had a 50% investment in this little hobby. And so she started exerting herself. And if you know Maker's Mark, you really know as much about what she did as what he did, because she designed the package. She became the first woman that we think in the world, certainly in the United States, to ever design a whiskey package, from the name to the bottle to the whole thing. And the reason she did it by herself was she didn't play well with other people. And she is just a little bit of a control freak. And so she did this on her own. And I'll never forget that I was in high school, and I was the photography editor for our yearbook. And I had a wonderful little laboratory down in the basement under the steps, where I would take the photographs and develop them and do the layout work and all. And I come down to do some work after school one day, and she's got all my shit out in the hall, and the door's locked. So I don't know what's going on, but I got this work I got to do. So I go up and talk to her, and she said, "Well, give me 2 months." And I said, "Well, don't have 2 months." She said, "Can you give me a month?" And I said, "Yeah." I had no idea what she was doing. Dad didn't know what she was doing. But she was designing the Maker's Mark bottle down there. And she came out 30 days later, like she said, with a model that she had made from paper mache.
Wow.
And put it up in our breakfast room, covered it up with a towel, and we sat down for dinner. Dad, this was a small room that had a bay window. Dad sat down in the alcove. And we always knew when she had something serious to talk about, she would push the table down that way so he couldn't get out. And this was going to be one of those times. And my 2 sisters and I were looking for a food fight, because she didn't like somebody to tell her that she didn't know what she's doing. So after dinner, she pulled the sheet off. Dad's trying to be polite. And if you know Maker's Mark, you know it's got the red wax on top. Well, Dad got off to a bad start. So he says, "Marge, it's real nice, but what is that goop on top?" So that aggravated her a little bit. And then he got serious. He was a mechanical engineer, so he was looking for practical stuff. He said, "How are we going to get that stuff on the bottle? And how is the customer going to get it off the bottle?" Because he was thinking, well, they're going to have to get a butcher knife, then they're going to whack around, they're going to cut themselves, then we're going to get a bunch of lawsuits. Her answer was, "That's your problem." And he kept pursuing, and she kept getting angrier. So finally, she just put her hands on the table, stood up, and looked him right straight in the eye, and she said, "Bill, do you remember when we were at the University of Louisville together?" They both were in the same class. She was in chemistry, he was in mechanical engineering. And he said, "Yes." And she shut him up with, "And do you remember who finished first in the class?" And my sisters and I were pretty sure it wasn't him. So there was no further discussion about the goop, and they never talked about the name. The Maker's Mark name came, and you'll see it today. She collected English pewter, and it's an interesting collection. It's not a particularly good collection, other than the fact that only one piece comes from each noted pewter smith from England. She was able to collect a piece from about 60 to 65% of all the noted pewter makers in England before 1840.
Wow.
And you're going to see that today. And of course, that's the touch mark. Generically, it's the Maker's Mark. It's the mark of the maker. The craftsman that is sufficiently proud of their work to market. And so that's where the name came from. She was also a calligrapher as a hobby. So what you see as on the label, that's an internationally registered type style. She created the Maker's Mark type style, which is now registered. And the shape of the bottle, she did it, the whole thing. And it's really become an iconic spirits bottle, I think primarily because it was created by somebody that didn't know what she's doing. And I used to tell her, I said, she's the best example of the concept that experience gets in the way of innovation. She had none. Everybody else that does this around the world knew exactly what they were doing. All of them came to the same answer. But she came with one. And the first time it got us in trouble, and I love this, the president of Delta Airlines was from Kentucky. And the executive vice president of Delta was also from Kentucky. And both of them were big Maker's Mark drinkers. And they didn't understand why we didn't have makers on the airlines. So they came up one time and put a pretty vigorous sales pitch on my dad and I. And they said, we'd love to have makers, but we can't have the wax because, can you imagine the wax all over the airplane? He said, no wax, no makers. And they finally yielded. And it was a mess for about 5 years. Then they got a new president. He couldn't take the wax either, so he got rid of us. But we really had a lot of fun with this. But it really was a hobby. We went 20 years before Dad claimed we made a profit. That was my first year back. And one of the board members stood up and said, you'd make a profit, because Dad wasn't taking a salary. So it was really about 22, 23 years before this little hobby took over. And of course, now it's become a major international brand. I think what we're most proud of, and I think what you'll see, is that we still stick to the founders' visions. We have, instead of one farmer now, like I said, we got 25 grain farmers, but they all march to the same tune. And all the grain that we secure comes from within 40 miles of the distillery. Let me tell you just a little bit about where I came from, because I went out of my way not to be part of this hobby because I couldn't take hanging around Mom. She was too dictatorial. And I knew even though she didn't work at the company, I knew she was going to be all over me. So I decided at a really young age, like 6, that I was going to be an architect. And I would go visit my godfather, who was next door, and you're going to know who he is. It was a gentleman named Jim B. He was Grandpa's best friend, and he was my godfather. And I was his babysitter when I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old before he passed away. And one day we're making a building with Lincoln logs, and he said, "Son, what are you going to do when you grow up?" And I said, I think I want to be an architect. And he got real serious looking. He said, "You don't want to do that, and I'll tell you why." He said, "Everybody in your family that's ever tried to do anything except make and sell whiskey screwed it up." And then he provided some pretty specific examples, but he only did, I'd come on a Tuesday and he'd tell me one thing we screwed up. I'd go home and announce at dinner what I'd learned, and that screwed up. The colonel was over laughing his ass off. And so I come over a couple of days later and he'd tell me the next one. But a couple of them were, pretty bizarre. Number one, he opened a bank, and the bank building is still there. People's Bank of Bardstown. He opened it October 1, 1929. Well, and then before that, he had another little episode where he wanted to get in the horseless carriage business. And so he was all set up to become the first automobile dealer in Bardstown. And he narrowed it down because back in those days, people were converting carriages and putting little steam engines on them and stuff. And he got it down between Ford and Franklin and chose Franklin. And that lasted about 6 months. And it was on and on and on. So many years later, when I'm in the business, I wrote an article about you need to stick to your niche. And the experiences we had when we got outside making and selling whiskey. And I told them about all of our business failures in this ad. Mom and Dad were down in Florida. Dad called me up and he said, "Son, your memory's pretty good, but did you ever wonder why Jim Beam knew so much about all of our business failures?" And I said, "Dad, it never crossed my mind." He said, "Well, the old bastard was a partner in all of them." Hope we're going the right way. I guess we are. Now, let me just a little bit more about how I got suckered into all this. Because Colonel Bean sort of convinced me I didn't want to be an architect. But I always had it in the back of my mind. So when I was a senior in high school, I was still talking about it. Dad knew I didn't have the creative ability. So we went down to a vocational service in Louisville, and I took a creativity test and finished lower than anybody they'd ever tested. So as we're leaving the test room, the guy who ran the business said, "Son, you're not going to be good at this. Why don't you think about being an engineer? You don't have to be creative to be it." So I said, "That's good enough." So off I go to engineering school. First day in school, the president of the university had just been tapped by President Eisenhower to create NASA. Keith Glennon was the president of what's now Case Western. And he was going off to create NASA, and he told all of the freshman class, he said, "Any of y'all that want a position in NASA or would like to contract with NASA through one of the universities, I can set it up for you. Just write me a letter." So I did. When I graduated 4 years, and I got a wonderful position, got a fellowship out at Berkeley, and worked on the Polaris missile. Actually, 4 of us had a task to create, design, develop, and test the first non-graphite rocket nozzle. And it was used on the Polaris missile, Polaris A2, the second stage of Polaris. You know, that's the submarine missile. And this didn't end very well either. We were, they worked us too hard for one thing. We were going to school full time and had a full time responsibility with regard to this NASA project, which had a deadline. And so we're working too hard. We're up testing this thing one night, and we forgot to bolt the motor down to the test bay, and the test motor was over 3,600 pounds, and it broke loose and did about $10 million worth of damage. And that was back 1964. And so the next morning, all 4 of us got fired. And that was the end of my distinguished engineering career. So here's what I did. This was big news out there, by the way. It was out in California. And I was afraid it was going to end up being big news in Kentucky. So I wanted to kind of brace Dad for what was coming. So I called him up. And I say, "Dad, you know, I've been screwing around with aerospace, and I've got all these engineering degrees. I bet I could come back and really help you make something out of this hobby." And he said, he didn't say that for a long while. And then he said, "Well, son, what can you do?" And I said, I was really offended. I said, "Well, I design rocket nozzles." And he didn't say anything for the longest time. He said, "You know, we don't do rocket nozzles down here for the snow. What else can you do?" And I'm kind of quick on my feet. I said, "Well, just let me talk to Bob." So I kind of whispered in her ear about what had happened, and I'd gotten fired. I liked to eat. And she went and talked to him, and he didn't bend. So I was, I had to figure it out on my own. So at that point, I decided what I really wanted to do was be a patent attorney. So I had 2 engineering degrees, and I needed to go to law school. So I applied, and I got in Vanderbilt. And I'm down there in school. I was in a good position because the Jack Daniels corporate office was right across the street from the law school. And the Montlows were really good friends of ours. The Montlows are Jack Daniels' nephews. And so Mr. Montlow, who was the chairman, Hap Montlow, would take me to dinner to Jimmy Kelly's every other Friday night for 3 years. And he's convinced I'm going back to the hobby. And I'm convinced I ain't going back to the hobby. I'm going somewhere and be a patent attorney. So we're getting ready to graduate. And I apply for a job as a manager at the Bendix Corporation in South Bend, which made brakes. And they had just started an intellectual property department. And I applied for a management position. That I wouldn't even a lawyer. But I had a secret weapon. And the secret weapon was I had worked in the patent office, U.S. Patent Office, the 2 years I in law school. And it was at that time that patent applications, the queue for patent applications was unbelievable. And I knew all the people that could get you around the queue. So that was my sales pitch. And besides, I worked with Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was the secretary back then. And I still do him. And so I laid it all out. He said, well, do you know any patent law? And I said, no, I hadn't taken a single patent law course. All I did work in the patent office. I knew all the examiners, I knew the commissioner, and I knew the secretary. I got the job. But it's not what you know, it's who you know. So anyway, and it's a lot of money. And so I go back and I say, Hap, I'm taking you to dinner tonight. And Mr. Montlow and I go back to Jimmy Kelly, and I can't wait to tell him. And I get it out of my mouth, and Hap says, son, I got some bad news for you. You're going to have to turn that down. He said, I've been putting up with your sorry ass for 3 years, and you're going to take the bar exam, just in case it don't work out. But you're going to go back and work with your father to do for Kentucky whiskey what my family did for Tennessee whiskey. And it just bolted right into my head. I said, yes, sir, that's what we're going to do. And at the time I said, well, I can give him a year since he was so nice to me, the 3 years. And that's been about 60-something years ago. Not 60, 50-something years ago. And I've enjoyed every minute of it. And I think y'all will really enjoy your visit down here. I will tell you, my first assignment, I show up the first day and my worst fears were realized. Mom was on site. And she said, I got a job for you. And I come this close to shoot my foot off. I'm thinking, well, hell, I don't work for her. But I didn't say it. And that first job was go to the courthouse and research the history of the old distillery. It's the one Dad bought in 1953 to start his project. It was, and she said, this is a very historic place. And if you'll go do the research, I'll write the application. And maybe we can get some protections around here to save the old buildings. And so I did, and she did, and it became the industry's first National Historic Landmark. And so Rob, my son, and I have, shall we say, small disputes about what constitutes conserving and what constitutes abusing these old buildings. And some of them you can't even recognize, but they're there. But only a small part of it's there. But the great majority of them go back to the 1870s. And the preservation has been good. The next, has anybody heard of the Bourbon Trail, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail?
Yeah.
All right, let me tell you how that got started. Uh, I'm sitting down with my father. Dad didn't talk much, so I didn't get much help in in how to do my job. So I'm flailing away, not getting much done. Oh, by the way, I still have my job description, and it said, "Go find customers." That's all it said. And of course, the other part of it he didn't say was, "Keep the hell out of the distillery. We don't need any more explosions down." So we're working on Mom and I are working on the national landmark status. She shows up one morning in Dad's office. I happen to be there, and she announces that's kind of the way she did. She didn't ask, she just announced what was going to happen next. And her announcement was to my father, "We need to have a visitor program down here." And Dad said, "That is a marvelous idea, Marge." And then she spins around and leaves, expecting him to go do it. So I say, "Why do we need a visitor program at the distillery? We've never had a visitor." He said, "I don't know, but I'll find out tonight and tell you." And so I come down the next morning. I stayed awake all night trying to figure out why we need to spend money we didn't have to do something that nobody cared about. I get down and I said, "Dad, have you figured it out?" He said, "Yes. It's about your sister, Leslie. She just got fired from her job as the ground hostess at the Louisville airport, and she needs a job, and all she can do is talk." So, and besides, it gave Mom access to the buildings. The national landmark status gave her control over the outside of the buildings. If we're having visitors, that gave her control to the inside of the buildings. So she's worming her way in pretty good. And and out of that, because all the distilleries work together, this is an amazing industry. It's a small industry. It's centered in Kentucky. There's distilleries everywhere. Only good bourbon is made in Kentucky. Don't forget that. Actually, the shortest way to remember it is that Kentucky bourbon is one word. Every other bourbon is a fake. And we really do work together. After 3 or 4 years, my younger sister was able to get some visitors, and she went to 3 of the distilleries in Bardstown, and we worked up a way to help put people in beds in the motels in Bardstown. And so that was the beginning back in the late 1960s. It's really become a very major tourist attraction. And the thing I'm proudest of is that every single distillery does it the very best they can. I mean, they're all phenomenal. There's not a slacker in the group. And we all way overspend. And of course, y'all know why. It's because of our egos. It has nothing to do with a commercial decision. We're just trying to outshine each other. And the benefactor has been the state of Kentucky. So I'm gonna let y'all. Does anybody got any questions about anything? You are going to get to go through the distillery, and I hope you'll get to go through part of the farm. There's a lot of great things. We have lamb and wagyu, and of course everything you need to make a cocktail. We have a wonderful mushroom farm, and we have a little animal called Star. He's an Italian truffle star. And yesterday I had some really important people down yesterday, and I want to show them off Star. Well, hell, they've got Star at the groomer getting ready for the day.
I think stars in the. I think stars in our truffle dog kennel.
Oh, really?
I think so.
Oh, well, that's exciting because we're down here in the woods. Nobody celebrates what we do now. The dog's a star. But we'll take it. We'll take it. Well, I would suspect we're about halfway there. Is that right, boss? Hey, we're about at it.